Jonathan Cole never thought dinner could turn into a public lesson about dignity. On a warm Friday night in Boston, he put on his best navy suit, helped his wife Maya zip her emerald dress, and smiled as their kids, 10-year-old Ethan and 8-year-old Lila, argued over who would try the lobster first. It was supposed to be a celebration. The president of a massive mining corporation had personally invited Jonathan to a luxury restaurant in the city's financial district, a place where power brokers met, where deals worth millions were sealed over crystal glasses. Jonathan had worked for years to bring this partnership to life. Tonight the final contract would be signed, but when the Cole family stepped through the golden doors of Le Parfum, every eye in the room froze. The maitre d', tall and polite until he noticed their skin color, blocked the entrance with a strained smile. "I'm sorry, sir. This is a private event." Behind him, a group of well-dressed white patrons walked right in without even showing a reservation. Maya's smile faded. The children looked up at their father, confused. Jonathan showed the printed invitation, the embossed seal of the mining company gleaming under the chandelier. Still, the maitre d' shook his head. "Maybe you have the wrong restaurant. Humiliation is quiet before it burns." Jonathan took a breath and whispered, "We'll wait outside." On the sidewalk, under the same lights that had welcomed everyone else, his son asked, "Dad, did we do something wrong?" Jonathan knelt beside him. "No, son. Sometimes people forget what respect looks like, but they always remember when they see it again." Minutes later, black SUVs pulled up. Reporters, cameras, and the company's president, Mr. Anderson, stepped out. The same staff who had turned the Coles away now scrambled to look busy. Anderson's voice boomed, "Where's Jonathan Cole, the man of the hour?" The maitre d' went pale. In that instant, the power flipped. The man they had dismissed was the guest everyone had been preparing to honor. Jonathan didn't raise his voice, didn't demand revenge. He simply walked past the trembling staff and said, "Let's eat." That night, a lesson worth more than any contract was served at Le Parfum. Respect has no color, and dignity never needs a reservation. They told him, "We don't serve people like you here." He didn't argue, he didn't shout. He just looked at his wife, held his children's hands, and waited. 10 minutes later, the same people who humiliated him were begging for forgiveness. They had no idea who he really was. "Before we begin, let me ask you something. Have you ever been judged before someone even knew your name? Stay until the end, because what happened inside that restaurant changed more than one man's night. It changed the meaning of respect itself. And I'd love to know, Zine, where are you watching this from? Tell me your city and country in the comments. It's amazing to see how far stories like this can travel across the world. And if you believe character matters more than color, hit that like, subscribe, and share this story, because the world needs more voices that remind us what dignity truly looks like. It was one of those Boston evenings that looked like it had been painted for success. Clear skies, yellow streetlights, and the quiet hum of a city winding down after a long week. Jonathan Cole adjusted his cufflinks as he stepped out of his black sedan. His reflection stared back from the restaurant's glass doors, confident, composed, ready. Tonight wasn't just another dinner. Tonight was history. Inside Le Parfum, waiters moved like choreography, trays balanced, silverware glinting beneath golden chandeliers. The sound of crystal glasses and soft jazz filled the air. Maya Cole, radiant in an emerald green dress, stepped out beside him, her hand resting gently on his arm. Their 2 children followed close behind, Ethan, 10, curious and wide-eyed, and Lila, 8, clutching a small purse shaped like a butterfly. "Daddy," Lila whispered, "is this where rich people eat?" Jonathan smiled. "Tonight, sweetheart, it's where good people eat." He meant it, because for him this wasn't about luxury, it was about arrival. After years of engineering negotiations, late-night reports, and endless flights across continents, Jonathan had finally helped secure a multi-billion-dollar mining partnership, the kind that could change entire communities. The company's president, Mr. Anderson, had chosen this restaurant for the official signing, a night to celebrate hard work, talent, and trust. As the Cole family approached the door, laughter spilled from inside, confident, expensive laughter. Maya squeezed her husband's hand. "You earned this," she said. Jonathan nodded. "We earned this." But the moment the maitre d' noticed them, the rhythm of the night broke. A pause. A flicker of confusion crossed his face. Then came the polite smile, the kind that hides discomfort rather than kindness. "Good evening," Jonathan greeted warmly. "Reservation for Cole. Party of 4. The maitre d' hesitated. "Ah, I believe tonight's event is private." Jonathan showed the printed invitation embossed in gold. "Yes, I know, we were invited." The man's smile faltered. "Of course, just a moment." He disappeared inside, leaving the family waiting at the entrance. Through the glass, they could see tables being set, wine being poured, other families being welcomed with ease. Maya's fingers tightened around her daughter's shoulder. Ethan shifted awkwardly, tugging at his tie. Jonathan stayed still, calm, patient. He had been in rooms like this before, rooms that whispered you don't belong. But he also knew what silence could do, because silence, in the right hands, can become the loudest answer. And in less than an hour, everyone inside that restaurant would hear it. The maître d' returned with another man, tall, middle-aged, his grey suit pressed sharp enough to cut. The gold name tag on his chest read, Robert Winslow, General Manager. His smile came polished, rehearsed, the kind people wear when they're about to say something unpleasant. "Good evening," Robert began smoothly. "I'm afraid there's been a slight misunderstanding. Tonight's dinner is a private corporate event." Jonathan kept his tone calm. "Yes, I'm aware. I'm with Anderson Mining. I'm the project representative. Here's our invitation." He handed over the thick cream card again, embossed with the company's seal. Robert took it, glanced at it too quickly and handed it back as if it were contaminated. "I see. Unfortunately, sir, this event requires a specific guest list at the door." "My name should be on it," Jonathan said evenly. Behind them, two older couples arrived. The maître d' immediately stepped aside for them, ushering them in with warm smiles. "Welcome back, Mr. and Mrs. Donnelly. Your table's ready." The contrast burned. Jonathan stood there in silence, watching. The children noticed it too, the way the staff bowed to one family and froze before another. Maya tried to keep her voice soft. "Sir, perhaps you could double-check the list?" Robert's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I assure you, ma'am, we're following protocol. Perhaps you'd feel more comfortable at one of our partner restaurants across the street. More family-friendly options." "Family-friendly," Maya repeated quietly. Her voice cracked on the second word. Ethan tugged on his father's sleeve. "Dad, why won't they let us in?" Jonathan knelt down beside him, whispering, "Because some people need time to learn what respect looks like." Then he straightened his shoulders, looked Robert in the eye and said, "We'll wait. Inside or outside?" Robert blinked. "Excuse me?" "We'll wait," Jonathan repeated, his voice steady. "Because when Mr. Anderson arrives, he'll want to know we're on time." The words landed like stones on marble. Robert hesitated, then gestured stiffly toward a small waiting area by the entrance. Not inside, not outside. The space meant for delivery drivers and late reservations. The family sat there quietly. No one spoke. The hum of laughter from inside the dining room leaked through the frosted glass, a cruel reminder of a door that wouldn't open. A hostess walked by, carrying menus for another party, her eyes darting away quickly when she saw the coals. She didn't want to be part of whatever situation this was. Maya exhaled slowly. "You don't deserve this," she whispered. Jonathan reached for her hand. "No one does." Outside, the city kept moving. Taxis, horns, lights. Inside, a storm was gathering, because soon the man they were waiting for would walk through that same door, and the world inside Le Parfum would never look the same again. The glass doors of Le Parfum swung open with a gust of late-evening air and camera flashes. Black SUVs had just pulled to the curb. Security men stepped out first, followed by a line of assistants carrying leather folders. Then came Mr. Richard Anderson, silver hair, bold smile, and the kind of confidence that came from running one of the biggest mining corporations in the country. The maître d' straightened his tie. Robert, the manager, smoothed his jacket. Every waiter froze mid-step. The atmosphere shifted from elegance to panic. "Good evening, Mr. Anderson," Robert greeted, voice trembling with excitement. Anderson clapped him on the shoulder. "Evening, son. Big night tonight, huh? Let's make sure it's perfect." He looked around, scanning the tables prepared for the event. "Everything ready for our guest of honor?" "Absolutely, sir," Robert replied. "We've taken care of every detail." Anderson smiled. "Excellent. Where's Mr. Cole?" The question cut through the room like thunder. The chatter stopped. Robert blinked. I'm sorry, who?" "Jonathan Cole," Anderson repeated. "The man who made this partnership possible. The reason we're all here tonight." A nervous silence stretched across the marble floor. Waiters exchanged glances. The maître d' swallowed hard. Anderson's eyes narrowed. "Don't tell me he's not here. He's never late." Finally, the hostess whispered, "There's a family waiting by the entrance." Anderson turned. Through the glass he saw Jonathan, standing tall beside his wife and children, waiting quietly near the door like unwanted guests. His expression changed instantly. Good Lord. He pushed past the staff and hurried toward the entrance. Cameras followed him. Diners craned their necks. Jonathan! Anderson's voice filled the lobby. My friend, I was starting to think you'd gotten lost. Jonathan smiled politely. We've been right here. Anderson's eyes flicked toward the maitre d' and Robert, realization dawning. Right here? He repeated softly, then louder. You mean to tell me you've been waiting? The staff froze. No one spoke. Anderson stepped aside, gesturing grandly toward the dining hall. Please, Jonathan, Maya, come in, your table's waiting. Every gaze in the restaurant followed them as the Cole family walked through the doors that had just been shut on them. The same hands that had refused to open the door now pulled out their chairs. The same voices that had dismissed them now whispered apologies under their breath. And as Jonathan sat down, his daughter leaned close and whispered, Daddy, they look scared. He smiled faintly. That's not fear, sweetheart. That's realization. Because tonight, realization was finally being served, hot and unavoidable. When Mr. Anderson and the Cole family crossed the threshold, every sound in Le Parfum seemed to dissolve. Glasses froze mid-air, forks hovered above plates, conversations died halfway through words. The maitre d' stood stiff beside the host podium, his face the color of paper. Anderson turned slowly to him. You said everything was ready, Robert. Is this how you ready an evening for my guests? Robert's lips twitched. Mr. Anderson, there must have been confusion. Confusion? Anderson's tone stayed calm, but each word hit like a hammer. The only confusion here is how you thought you could treat my lead representative like he doesn't belong. Jonathan remained silent, his hand resting lightly on Lila's shoulder. He didn't need to speak yet. His presence spoke louder than outrage ever could. Anderson motioned to a waiter. Bring the Cole family our best table. The waiter hesitated for a second, then rushed to obey. As they walked deeper into the restaurant, eyes followed them, some guilty, some curious, some pretending not to notice at all. Maya held her head high. The children walked taller too. When they sat, Anderson stayed standing. Robert, before we start this dinner, I'd like an explanation. What exactly happened here tonight? Robert swallowed. It was protocol, sir. The staff wasn't informed of the guest's identity. Protocol, Anderson interrupted, should never replace common decency. He turned toward the maitre d'. You stopped this family at the door? The man nodded weakly. Yes, sir, but only because... Because of what? Anderson asked. Because they didn't look like they belonged? Silence. The guests at nearby tables stared at their plates, pretending to eat. A single violin in the background carried on playing, slow, haunting, like it understood everything that words couldn't. Jonathan finally spoke, his voice steady. Please, Mr. Anderson, don't ruin anyone's evening over this. I've learned something tonight. Sometimes you can't teach respect with punishment, you teach it by example. Anderson looked at him, eyes softening. You're a better man than most of us, Jonathan. Then he faced the staff. But make no mistake, what happened here will be remembered. Not for shame, but for change. The maitre d' bowed his head. Yes, sir. Jonathan looked around the room, at the chandeliers, the porcelain plates, the people who had watched it all happen. He didn't see enemies, he saw witnesses, because sometimes the world doesn't change when you shout. Sometimes it changes when you refuse to. The waiters moved like ghosts now. No chatter, no confidence, just quiet hands setting down plates that trembled slightly against the porcelain. The Cole family sat at the center of the restaurant that had refused them only minutes earlier. Every polished fork, every wineglass gleamed beneath the chandeliers, as if the room itself were trying to apologize. Jonathan unfolded his napkin, smiling gently at his wife. Maya, he said, let's enjoy dinner. We earned it. Her eyes shimmered. Are you handling this better than anyone else would? He shook his head. If I let anger lead, the lesson gets lost. Across the room, the maitre d' hovered near the wall, watching. The same man who had blocked the door now stood like a statue, unsure whether to breathe. Anderson noticed him and gestured to pour the wine. The bottle nearly slipped from the man's hand as he filled Jonathan's glass. Thank you, Jonathan said softly. 2 words, calm, deliberate, forgiving, that carried the weight of a sermon. Around them, conversation began to return in scattered murmurs, but now it sounded different, less arrogant, more cautious. The other guests stole glances at the family, each one seeing their own reflection in the shame that hung over the room. Ethan cut his steak carefully, whispering to his sister, "Mum, are we supposed to act normal?" Maya smiled. "We act like ourselves, sweetheart. That's more than normal." Anderson leaned forward. "Jonathan, you've given this company everything. Your expertise, your patience, your vision. And after what happened tonight—" Jonathan interrupted gently. "Richard, please. Don't let one moment undo what we've built. What matters isn't who made the mistake. It's what we all learn from it." The words sank deep. Even the violinist in the corner slowed his bow as if listening. Anderson nodded. "Then let's make sure everyone here remembers this night for the right reason." He stood up, glass raised. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice echoing off marble and glass. "Tonight, I want to make a toast to the man who reminded us what professionalism, grace, and strength really look like, to Mr. Jonathan Cole." The crowd hesitated. Then one by one, glasses lifted. "For Jonathan Cole," they echoed. Jonathan smiled faintly, but didn't stand. He looked at his children instead. "This," he whispered, "is what respect sounds like when the world finally listens." And in that quiet applause, you could hear more than celebration. You could hear change beginning to breathe. As the last echoes of the toast faded, the air inside Le Parfum seemed different, softer, humbled. Waiters moved with careful grace, and the same chandeliers that had once spotlighted arrogance now illuminated awareness. Jonathan cut into his meal slowly. He wasn't eating for taste, he was thinking about how easily respect could vanish when judgment walked into the room first. Maya noticed his silence. "You're still upset, aren't you?" He smiled faintly. "No, just reminded." "Reminded of what?" "That the world can build skyscrapers, machines, entire industries, but it still struggles to build respect." From nearby tables came whispers disguised as conversations. "That's him," one woman murmured to her husband. "Such composure," he replied. "I would have walked out." The maitre d', still stationed near the door, finally approached. His steps were hesitant, like walking toward his own reflection. "Sir," he began, voice trembling, "on behalf of the staff, I want to apologize. I didn't realize who you were." Jonathan set down his fork. His eyes lifted slowly, calm but firm. "And if I were someone else?" he asked. The man blinked. I don't follow. If I weren't someone important, would the door have stayed closed?" Silence. The maitre d' couldn't find an answer, because the truth had already answered for him. Jonathan gestured gently toward his family. "My children saw everything tonight. One day they'll tell this story. What I hope they remember isn't what you did, it's what you'll do next." The man's eyes filled with shame. "Yes, sir, you're right." Jonathan extended his hand. "Then start there." It wasn't pity. It was grace, the kind that teaches harder than punishment ever could. Across the table, Anderson watched, speechless. The power dynamic had flipped entirely, but Jonathan never used it to humiliate, only to enlighten. Maya reached for his hand beneath the table. "You always find the higher road," she whispered. He smiled. "The view's better up here." The maitre d' bowed slightly and stepped back. Moments later, he instructed the staff to serve dessert, not to Jonathan, but to the entire restaurant, on the house. "For everyone," he said quietly, "in honor of Mr. Cole." As servers moved from table to table, the atmosphere transformed. What began as a dinner of arrogance ended as a lesson in humanity. Even the violinist changed his melody. No longer background noise, but a soft hymn of understanding. And for the first time that night, Le Parfum truly earned its name, because the scent that filled the air wasn't luxury anymore. It was humility. By the time dessert was cleared, no one was speaking about food anymore. Every conversation in Le Parfum had turned into a confession. Guests leaned across tables whispering things like, "Can you believe what they did?" and "He handled it with so much grace." The maitre d' stood near the bar, watching the family he'd once tried to turn away. He kept replaying Jonathan's words, "Start there," like a sentence he couldn't forget. Outside, a young reporter who'd come to photograph the corporate dinner had caught the moment when Anderson embraced Jonathan at the entrance. Within minutes, the image was online. A black family enters the city's most exclusive restaurant after being refused service, saved by dignity, not anger. By midnight, the story had started spreading. Comment sections filled with outrage, praise, and reflection. People debated whether Le Parfum would survive the scandal. Others simply wrote, "That man showed the world what class really means." Meanwhile, Jonathan and his family walked out quietly through the same doors that had once closed in their faces. No press statement, no fury, just a calm good night to the valet and a wave to the doorman, who now couldn't meet his eyes. In the car, Ethan stared out the window. "Dad," he asked softly, "why are people so mean sometimes?" Jonathan thought for a moment, because they forget they could be better. "But tonight," he said, glancing at the restaurant behind them, "I think a few remembered." Maya reached over, lacing her fingers through his. "You changed something tonight," he smiled. "Maybe. Or maybe we just reminded people what change looks like." Back inside, Anderson called an emergency meeting with the staff. No shouting, just truth. "This company," he said, "doesn't sign billion-dollar deals with people who can't treat others with basic humanity. From tomorrow, this restaurant changes or it closes." The staff nodded, some in tears. For the first time that evening, Robert removed his manager's badge and placed it on the table. "Mr. Cole deserves better. Everyone does." Anderson exhaled. "Then let's make sure tonight isn't remembered as shame, but as a start." Outside, the city lights shimmered on the windshield as Jonathan drove away. In a single night, humiliation had turned into hope and silence into a story that refused to stay quiet. Because sometimes the loudest revolutions don't begin with protests or speeches. Sometimes they begin at a dinner table, where respect is finally served. By dawn, the story had already outrun the night. A single photo, Mr. Anderson embracing Jonathan Cole under the golden lights of Le Parfum, was everywhere. Morning shows replayed it. Headlines called it "The Dinner That Changed Boston." Commentators debated whether it was racism, elitism, or both. But ordinary people saw something simpler, a man who answered humiliation with dignity. Jonathan woke to hundreds of messages. Old college friends, engineers from the mine sites, even strangers wrote, "You handled it with more class than the whole restaurant combined." He smiled, but he didn't feel victorious. "Viral," he said quietly, "should never be the same thing as meaningful." Maya handed him coffee. "Then make it meaningful." That same morning, Mr. Anderson held a press conference on the courthouse steps. Flanked by cameras, he announced, "As of today, Le Parfum will close for restructuring and reopen under a new management team, and I've asked Mr. Cole to lead a corporate initiative on equality and professional ethics across all our subsidiaries." Reporters shouted questions, but one line carried across every network. Last night wasn't about business, it was about respect, and respect will now be part of our business plan. Within 48 hours, the clip had been viewed 10 million times. Universities invited Jonathan to speak. Community leaders called him the man who changed the conversation without raising his voice. Meanwhile, inside their home, life remained normal, or tried to. Ethan still had math homework. Lila still practiced piano. But when their teacher asked the class to share someone they admire, Lila said, "My dad, because he fixed something that was broken without breaking anyone." That quote spread too. By the end of the week, a local journalist titled an editorial "The Color of Respect." The phrase stuck. It became the name of Jonathan's new foundation, one that funded scholarships for minority engineers and hospitality training programs focused on diversity. At the reopening of Le Parfum months later, the maitre d' who once blocked the door greeted guests with genuine warmth. He had gone through Jonathan's training himself. When the Coles arrived, he smiled sincerely. "Welcome back, Mr. Cole." Jonathan returned the smile. "It's good to see change served on the menu." And as the cameras clicked again, he wasn't just a man who'd endured injustice. He was proof that sometimes the best revenge isn't humiliation, it's transformation. What started as one man's quiet dignity had become a national conversation. Within a week, talk shows debated the Cole effect. Newspapers from coast to coast ran headlines like "The Dinner That Tasted Like Change" and "Grace Under Pressure, the Man Who Redefined Respect." Executives from Fortune 500 companies quoted Jonathan in board meetings. Some played the viral clip of him shaking the maitre d's hand as an example of leadership training. Even late-night hosts, usually focused on politics and celebrity scandals, told the story with awe. One of them said, "It's not every day someone wins a moral victory in a three-piece suit." But Jonathan never appeared on talk shows. He wasn't chasing attention. He kept working, designing safer mining infrastructure, mentoring young engineers, and quietly expanding his new foundation, The Color of Respect. Every donation went towards scholarships, job training, and diversity programs for industries that had long stayed segregated by silence. Meanwhile, other companies took notice. A Boston-based tech firm introduced a Cole Protocol, mandatory empathy and inclusion workshops starting from their executive level down to interns. Soon the phrase spread beyond business. At high schools, teachers used the restaurant story to discuss bias and integrity. At churches, pastors referenced Jonathan's calm strength in sermons about forgiveness and courage. Anderson often called him late at night. "You realize," he'd say, "we didn't just change a policy, we changed people." Jonathan would chuckle softly. "Policies fade, Richard. People last longer." Months later, when The Color of Respect held its first national conference, journalists packed the auditorium, expecting a dramatic speech. Instead, Jonathan began with a story, not about himself, but about his daughter. "She asked me why people were mean," he told them. "I told her they forget they could be better. That's why we're here, to remind them." The room went silent. Cameras clicked. But the audience wasn't applauding a hero. They were witnessing a mirror. Every person there saw a piece of themselves, the part that could choose humility over hate, patience over pride. Because sometimes change doesn't start in boardrooms or courtrooms. Sometimes it starts with a family waiting quietly at a closed door, and a man who refuses to knock louder because he knows the world will open soon enough. 3 months after the dinner that changed everything, Jonathan Cole's phone rang early one morning. The number on the screen wasn't familiar, but the voice on the other end was. "Mr. Cole, this is Senator Grace Holloway from the Committee on Social and Economic Development. The President would like to meet you." Jonathan blinked, unsure if he'd heard correctly. "Meet me? About what?" "About what you represent," the senator replied. "We believe your story could inspire national reform on workplace equality. The White House wants to hear it firsthand." That same week, Jonathan and his family flew to Washington, D.C. The city felt different, grand but distant, like a stage he never planned to walk on. He wasn't a politician, he wasn't a celebrity. He was an engineer who once waited outside a restaurant that wouldn't open its doors. But as the car passed the Lincoln Memorial, Maya reached for his hand. "Remember," she said softly, "you're not here because of what they did. You're here because of how you responded." The next morning, in a conference room lined with American flags and cameras, Jonathan sat across from senators, CEOs, and policy advisors. Senator Holloway introduced him. "This is the man who reminded the nation that respect doesn't require wealth, status, or color, only courage." Jonathan didn't use notes. His voice was calm, steady, almost humble. "I didn't come here to talk about racism or business," he began. "I came here to talk about humanity, the kind that slips away when power goes unchecked. That night in Boston wasn't just about a door that wouldn't open. It was about a system that teaches people who deserve to walk through and who doesn't. But that system isn't invincible. It's just made of habits, and habits can change." You could hear the click of pens stopping, the silence of a room realizing it was listening to more than a speech. It was a mirror. When he finished, the president stood and extended his hand. "Mr. Cole," he said, "you reminded us what leadership looks like when nobody's watching." Outside, reporters surrounded him, asking what it felt like to go from rejection to recognition. Jonathan smiled gently. "Doors open every day. The question is, who are we letting through?" That evening, as the sun dipped behind the Capitol, he turned to his family and said, "I never wanted fame. I wanted change. And maybe, just maybe, they're starting to sound the same." The story of Jonathan Cole didn't stop at the White House. Within months, it crossed oceans. Foreign newspapers translated headlines that once read, "The Color of Respect." In London, students quoted him during university debates. In Johannesburg, community leaders discussed his calm defiance as part of leadership training. And in Tokyo, a magazine featured him under the title, "The Engineer Who Redefined Power." Then came an invitation sealed in blue and gold from the United Nations. It wasn't just a conference. It was the World Summit on Human Dignity, gathering diplomats, activists, and CEOs from every continent. Jonathan hesitated before accepting. "I'm not an activist," he told Maya. "I just wanted dinner with my family." She smiled. "That's why they need you, because you're real." When he stepped into the UN Assembly Hall in New York, the air was electric. Rows of flags from nearly 200 nations framed the stage. He looked out at faces from every color, every faith, every background, and realized the irony. He'd once been denied entry to a restaurant, and now he was walking into the world's largest room of inclusion. A moderator introduced him, Jonathan Cole, an engineer, husband, father, and the man whose grace taught us more than 1,000 speeches ever could. He approached the podium slowly, no notes in hand. When he spoke, his voice filled the room, steady, humble, human, A door once closed on me and my family, but that door opened a bigger one, a conversation we all needed. I didn't want revenge, I wanted reflection, because the world doesn't need more noise, it needs more examples. He paused, letting the silence breathe. Cameras zoomed in on his face, calm, grounded, unshaken. I used to think success was about climbing, but real success, he said, is about lifting. The hall erupted in applause, not thunderous, but respectful, sustained. Some diplomats wiped away tears, others just nodded, quietly moved. Afterward, a delegate from Kenya approached him. "Mr. Cole, your story isn't American. It's human." Jonathan smiled. "That's the best compliment I've ever received." Outside, under the UN flags fluttering in the breeze, he told Maya, "I guess the American dream isn't just about getting in. It's about opening the door for others." And that night, as the lights of Manhattan reflected on the East River, Jonathan Cole understood that his story no longer belonged to him. It belonged to everyone still waiting at their own closed doors. Back home in Boston, the applause faded into quiet mornings again. The cameras were gone. The reporters had moved on to newer stories, and the Coles were left with something rarer than fame, peace. But for Jonathan, peace felt different now. He'd become a face, a headline, a movement, a quote repeated by strangers who would never know the sound of his real laugh or the way he hummed when fixing the sink. One night, after putting the kids to bed, he sat on the porch, watching the city lights blink in the distance. Maya came out with 2 cups of tea. "You've been quiet," she said softly. He smiled. "I used to be invisible. Now I feel like I'm everywhere, except here." She sat beside him. "You didn't ask for this." "No, but I answered it." He took a long sip, eyes still on the skyline. "People call me a hero, but heroes fix the world. I just refuse to break." Maya reached for his hand. "That's exactly why they call you one." From inside, they could hear laughter, the kids arguing over which bedtime story was next. Jonathan chuckled. "That's the sound I fought for. Not applause, just that." He opened his laptop, hundreds of unread emails, invitations, endorsements, but among them was one that caught his eye, a message from the maitre d'. "Mr. Cole, I wanted you to know, I've started volunteering at a youth center in Roxbury, teaching young people how to treat others with dignity. You said to start there. I did." Jonathan smiled, a tear threatening to form. Maya leaned over his shoulder. "See, you didn't start a movement, John. You started memory." He nodded. "That's better. Movements fade. Memories shape people." Outside, a breeze stirred the trees. The city felt softer somehow, as if it too was exhaling. Jonathan stood, gazing up at the same sky that had watched him walk through every door, both closed and open. "Funny," he said. "I thought that restaurant was the test." Maya tilted her head. "And it wasn't." He smiled. "No. The real test is staying kind after the world finally listens." She rested her head on his shoulder, and for the first time in months Jonathan felt small again, not in defeat, but in belonging. Because fame can echo, but love stays. 10 years later, the world had changed, or maybe it was just catching up. The foundation, the color of respect, now funded programs in more than 30 states and 8 countries. The once small Boston office had become a hub for education, ethics, and inclusion in industries that had forgotten what humanity looked like. But for Jonathan Cole, the most meaningful progress lived under his own roof. Ethan was now 20, tall and thoughtful, studying law at Harvard. Lila, 18, had chosen journalism, determined, she said, to tell stories that make people remember who they are. One evening, the family gathered around the same dinner table where everything had begun. The plates were mismatched, the lighting was warm, and the laughter was easy. Maya poured lemonade into glasses instead of wine now. Jonathan had more grey at his temples and a calmness that came only from surviving storms. "So," he asked with a grin, "what's the latest from My World Changers?" Lila smirked. "I'm writing an article about that restaurant case from years ago. You know, the one that went viral." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "Sounds familiar." "I want to revisit it," she said. "Not the outrage, the lesson. People need to hear it again, Dad. They've forgotten." Ethan leaned back in his chair. "And I'm taking your story to court, figuratively speaking. My thesis is about ethics in corporate law. You taught me the difference between legal and right." Jonathan smiled, that quiet, proud kind of smile that fills a room without making a sound. "You two are going to make me irrelevant." Maya laughed. "That's the goal, isn't it?" They all laughed, and for a moment the years melted away. Jonathan looked at them, and saw something the news could never capture, the slow miracle of seeds growing in silence. After dinner, Lila showed him an old photo, the one of Anderson hugging him at the restaurant entrance. "It still feels like yesterday," she said. Jonathan nodded. "That photo isn't about me. It's about what happens when grace wins." He stood looking out the window at the city that once tested him. "Every generation has its closed doors," he said, "but if you keep knocking with kindness, eventually they open." Ethan smiled. "And when they don't?" Jonathan turned to him. "Then you build your own." And just like that, the lesson lived on, no longer as a story of one man, but as a blueprint for the next. The years had been kind and honest. Jonathan's hair was now almost silver, his steps slower, but his voice carried the same calm authority that once silenced a restaurant full of arrogance. The world had moved on to new stories, new faces, new fights, but every so often, someone would still stop him on the street and say, "You're the man who taught us about respect." He always smiled politely, but deep down, he knew the lesson had never really been about him. One autumn morning, while getting ready for a foundation meeting, Jonathan felt something unfamiliar, a heaviness in his chest. He brushed it off, thinking it was age or exhaustion. But when the pain came back days later, Maya insisted he see a doctor. The diagnosis came quietly, the way life delivers its hardest truths. Gentle, almost apologetic. Early-stage heart condition, manageable but serious. The doctor's words echoed like a warning wrapped in kindness. "You've spent your life helping others," she said. "Now it's time to help yourself." That night, Jonathan sat alone in his study, surrounded by awards, photos, and newspaper clippings, snapshots of a life that had touched millions. Yet what held his attention wasn't the framed headline or the medal from the United Nations. It was an old drawing, one of Lila's childhood sketches. A door, half open, light spilling through the crack. He smiled softly. "Still opening, huh?" he whispered. Maya entered quietly, placing a blanket over his shoulders. "You're supposed to be resting," she teased. He chuckled. "I'm just thinking about how fast it all went." She sat beside him. "You gave the world more time than it gave you. That's something." Jonathan looked at her, eyes warm. "Do you ever wonder if it mattered?" She nodded. "It mattered to every person who opened their heart because you stayed calm when others would have shouted." He took her hand. "Maybe that's all legacy is, the echo of how we treated people." They sat there in silence, listening to the wind move through the trees outside. No applause, no headlines, just two people and the sound of a life well lived. As the clock ticked softly in the corner, Jonathan whispered, "If my heart slows down one day, at least it'll know it spent its beats on something that mattered." And Maya, with tears she didn't hide, answered, "It did, Jonathan. It always did." The house was quiet now. Ethan was married. Lila worked as a journalist overseas, and the city outside had long forgotten the noise of flashbulbs and headlines. But in one room, Jonathan Cole's study, the story was still alive. Stacks of letters covered his desk. Some came from students, others from strangers across the world. They all began the same way. "Your story changed how I see people." Jonathan read each one slowly, smiling at the words as if they were small windows opening one by one. His health had grown fragile. The doctor's warnings were no longer gentle suggestions but quiet reminders. Yet his spirit felt light, almost weightless. He spent his mornings writing, not speeches or reports, but letters, one to Ethan, one to Lila, and one final note addressed simply, "To whoever finds this." The letters weren't about success. They were about stillness. He wrote of moments, the taste of lemon pie at a humble diner, the sound of his daughter's laugh, the silence of waiting outside that restaurant years ago. He wrote that the hardest thing he ever learned wasn't how to forgive others, but how to forgive the world for not knowing better. In his final letter to Ethan, he wrote, "Don't let power make you louder. Let it make you listen longer." To Lila, he wrote, "Write stories that remind people they're capable of good, even when the world forgets." And on the envelope marked, "To whoever finds this," he wrote only one line, "Respect has no color, but it always leaves a trace." Weeks later, Jonathan passed peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by the love he had built, not the fame he had earned. At his memorial, leaders from around the world gathered, senators, activists, students, restaurant workers. But the most powerful moment came when the former maitre d' stepped forward, his voice trembling. "I once closed a door on this man. He opened every door after that, for me and for everyone who needed to learn what respect really means." Outside the church, A crowd stood in silence as the wind carried Jonathan's words across the city. The flags of Boston, the same city that once judged him, now flew half-mast in his honor. And somewhere, in a classroom, a courtroom, a quiet home, someone remembered the man who never shouted, never demanded, but always taught. Because some stories end with applause, but the greatest ones end with echoes, soft, steady, eternal. And the door he once waited outside of remained open. The sound of cameras clicking filled the air as the doors of Le Parfum opened once again. Only minutes earlier, those same doors had been a barrier. Now, they were a stage. Mr. Anderson's hand rested proudly on Jonathan Cole's shoulder as the two men stepped inside, followed by Maya, Ethan, and little Lila. Every table turned. Conversations froze mid-sentence. Glasses hovered above plates, half-raised, forgotten. Anderson's voice carried across the marble floor. "Ladies and gentlemen, may I present to you the man responsible for tonight's celebration, Mr. Jonathan Cole." A ripple moved through the crowd, part disbelief, part guilt. The maitre d', pale as linen, bowed his head. Robert, the general manager, stood motionless, eyes wide, as if realizing the whole evening had been a test, and he had failed. Jonathan paused near the entrance, taking in the room. He didn't smile. He didn't glare. He simply looked calmly, deeply, at the faces that had once looked through him. Then he extended his arm toward his wife. "Maya," he said softly, "shall we?" The family crossed the dining room together, walking past tables of stunned patrons. The chandeliers above seemed brighter now, their light glinting off every glass, every uneasy expression. Even the violinist faltered, missing a note before catching the melody again. At the center of the hall stood a large round table dressed in white linen, the seat of honor waiting. Anderson pulled the chair for Maya himself. "Tonight," he said, loud enough for all to hear, "we celebrate not only a partnership, but the kind of man every company hopes to stand beside." Polite applause began, hesitant, awkward, then grew stronger as people realized silence would only make their shame louder. Jonathan inclined his head in quiet acknowledgement. He did not rise to claim a spotlight. He let the moment speak for itself. Ethan leaned toward his sister. "They're clapping for Dad," he whispered. Lila nodded, her eyes wide. "They're clapping because they almost forgot who he was." Jonathan overheard and smiled faintly. "No, sweetheart," he said. "They're clapping because they just remembered who they are." And as the orchestra found its rhythm again, the Cole family finally sat down, not as guests tolerated, but as people restored to the place they had earned. Outside, the city lights flickered against the windows like applause from a larger world. Inside, dignity had taken its seat, and dinner at last could truly begin. The room had gone too quiet. The soft clinking of silverware had vanished. Even the background music seemed afraid to continue. Mr. Anderson's voice broke the silence, calm, deliberate, heavy with authority. "Robert," he said, turning toward the general manager, "I want to understand what happened here tonight." Robert's throat tightened. "Sir, there was confusion at the entrance. My staff—" "Confusion?" Anderson's tone sliced through the air. "The only confusion here is how you thought you could turn away the man this dinner was meant to honor." The maitre d' took a step back, wishing he could disappear. Anderson pointed to the staff lined along the wall. "All of you, did you know who Mr. Cole was?" No one answered. Heads dropped like falling leaves. Jonathan sat still, his hands folded, expression unreadable. He wasn't there to humiliate anyone. He wanted them to hear themselves, the echo of their own smallness. Anderson continued, "Jonathan Cole is the lead engineer behind the partnership that will employ thousands of people. The success of this company, and this city, depends on his work. And yet you treated him as if he didn't belong." Murmurs rippled through the diners. Cameras from journalists who had followed Anderson to the event clicked quietly, recording every second. Robert's voice trembled. "Sir, we didn't recognize him." Anderson's gaze hardened. "You didn't have to recognize him. You just had to respect him." Jonathan finally spoke, his voice low but steady. "Mr. Anderson," he said, "let them speak. Mistakes don't fix themselves through fear." Anderson nodded reluctantly. "Go ahead, Robert, explain yourself." Robert swallowed hard. "There's no excuse, sir. We judge by appearance, not by truth. I'll accept whatever consequence you decide." Jonathan stood, his calm presence commanding more attention than anger ever could. "No," he said gently. "Tonight isn't about punishment. It's about learning what respect costs and what it gives back." He turned toward the staff. You'll forget my name one day, that's fine, but don't forget this moment, because next time the person you turn away might not be me. It might be someone who needs you to believe in their worth. Anderson lowered his head slightly, humbled by the quiet wisdom in Jonathan's words. The crowd exhaled as if they'd been holding their breath for minutes. Outside, thunder rolled faintly in the distance, the kind of storm that doesn't destroy, but cleanses. And inside Le Parfum, the cleansing had just begun. The tension still hung thick in the air, as if the room itself was waiting to see what Jonathan Cole would do. He stood there quietly, the golden light from the chandeliers reflecting on the glass of water in front of him. Around him, guilt had taken human form, waiters with trembling hands, managers frozen in shame, and guests unable to look him in the eyes. Jonathan took a slow breath before speaking. "Mr. Anderson," he began softly, "I appreciate your loyalty, but tonight isn't about me. It's about something bigger than both of us." Anderson frowned slightly, still standing at the head of the table. "Bigger than what happened to you?" Jonathan nodded. "Bigger than what happened. It's about how we all respond to what happens." He turned to the staff, his voice calm but unyielding. "I could shout. I could demand someone lose their job. But what would that fix? Would it erase what my children saw tonight? Would it teach this restaurant, or this city, anything new?" No one moved. Even the violinist in the corner had stopped playing. Maya watched him closely, a quiet pride in her eyes. She knew this was her husband's strength, the power to rise without crushing anyone beneath him. Jonathan continued, "Respect isn't something you show when cameras are on. It's what you practice when no one's watching. It's how you treat people you think don't matter." He looked toward the maitre d', whose face was pale and drawn. "You thought I didn't belong here," Jonathan said, "but the truth is, we all belong everywhere dignity is present. If this place didn't have it before, it does now." The maitre d's eyes watered. "Sir, I'm so sorry." Jonathan gave a small nod. "Then prove it. Not to me, but to the next person who walks through that door." Anderson stepped closer. "Jonathan, you've just given them more grace than they deserve." Jonathan smiled faintly. "Grace doesn't measure who deserves it. It measures who gives it." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, from a nearby table, a guest began to clap, slow, hesitant. Another joined, then another, until the entire restaurant was standing, applauding the man who had turned humiliation into harmony. Jonathan sat down again quietly and reached for his wife's hand. "Now," he whispered, "let's finish dinner. We've earned it." And as he lifted his glass, the reflection of the chandelier shimmered across it. Not just light, but something brighter. Dignity, reborn. Silence had never sounded so heavy or so honest. After the applause faded, the restaurant seemed to exhale all at once, like a long-held breath finally released. No one was rushing anymore. No orders shouted, no heels clicking on marble. Just quiet, the kind that happens when people begin to see themselves clearly for the first time. Jonathan sat still, his hand resting gently on Lila's. She looked up at him, her eyes wide but calm. "Daddy," she whispered, "why did you forgive them?" He turned toward her, his voice soft, steady. "Because someone has to show them what forgiveness looks like, sweetheart. Otherwise the lesson ends with anger." She thought for a moment. "Does forgiveness make them good?" He smiled. "No, it makes us free." Maya reached over, brushing Lila's hair back from her face. "You'll remember this night for the rest of your life," she said. Lila nodded. "I will, because tonight I saw what strength really looks like." Across the room, the maitre d' and Robert stood together, shame still clinging to them. Then slowly they walked toward the table. "Mr. Cole," Robert began, his voice trembling, "there's no apology deep enough for what we did." Jonathan looked at him, not with anger, not even pity, but quiet understanding. "There's one," he said. "It's called change." Robert nodded, tears threatening to fall. "You have it, sir. From this day on, you have it." Jonathan stood, shook his hand firmly, and said only, "Then start tonight." The maitre d' looked down, his voice barely a whisper. "We'll never forget this, Mr. Cole." Jonathan replied, "Good, because forgetting is how it all begins again." Nearby, a few guests lowered their eyes, visibly moved. One woman took a deep breath and said quietly to her husband, "We've been blind, haven't we?" He just nodded, unable to answer. The violinist began to play again, slow, tender notes that wrapped around the room like a prayer. It wasn't music for entertainment anymore, it was music for repentance. Jonathan returned to his seat, watching his children smile faintly, unaware that they'd just witnessed something far greater than business or prestige. They'd seen a man rewrite the meaning of power, not through victory, but through virtue. And as the melody swelled, the restaurant glowed with a warmth it had never known before. It wasn't from the chandeliers, or the candles, or the polished glassware. It was the light that comes when hearts finally understand what respect truly means. When the music ended, the room was still. Every guest, every waiter, every pair of eyes was fixed on the two men standing at the center of Le Parfum. Mr. Anderson, the man who owned the night, and Jonathan Cole, the man who had just given it back its soul. Anderson cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his deep voice carrying across the marble and glass, "before we go any further, there's something that must be done. Here now, in front of all of you." He turned to Robert, the general manager, whose face had gone pale again. "Robert, you've served this establishment for years, but tonight you served pride instead of people." Robert's lips parted. "Sir, Anderson held up a hand. "Don't explain, reflect, because explanation is for mistakes. Reflection is for change." Then he looked toward Jonathan. "Mr. Cole, I owe you more than an apology. I owe you action." He faced the audience again. "Effective immediately, this restaurant's leadership will change. It will close for 1 month to retrain its entire staff, not just in service, but in humanity." A collective gasp swept through the room. Cameras clicked. Even the chandeliers seemed to listen. Jonathan remained silent, his expression calm, his eyes steady. Anderson turned back to him. "But before that happens, I want you, the man who showed us what real grace looks like, to have the final word." For a moment, Jonathan hesitated. He wasn't used to microphones or spotlights. He spoke best when hearts were quiet, not when rooms were watching. But tonight demanded words. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and stepped forward. "I didn't come here tonight expecting to teach anyone anything," he said. "I came to celebrate a partnership, a simple dinner with my family. But somewhere between the door and this table, we crossed a line that still divides too many rooms." The room hung on every syllable. "I don't need anyone fired or shamed," Jonathan continued. "I just need everyone here to remember, respect is free, but somehow it's still the hardest thing to give." He set the microphone down gently and looked around the room, not above anyone, not below, just equal. Then he added quietly, almost to himself, "Let's start serving it." A hush fell again, not the silence of fear, but of awakening. And for the first time, Le Parfum didn't feel like a restaurant anymore. It felt like a lesson. The microphone trembled slightly in Jonathan's hand, not from fear, but from the weight of what needed to be said. He took a breath, the kind that steadies the soul, and looked across the room. Every face was turned toward him. People who had once looked through him were now seeing him, maybe for the first time. He began quietly, almost conversationally. "When I was a kid," he said, "my mother told me that manners were just love with structure. I never forgot that. She said, when you hold the door for someone, you're really saying, 'I see you.'" A few guests shifted, uncomfortable but listening. "Tonight, a door closed on me and my family," he continued. "Not a physical one, and a human one. We weren't denied food or service. We were denied recognition, and that's something no policy can fix. Only hearts can." He paused, letting the words settle. Then his tone deepened, slow and deliberate. "I've heard people say it's just how the world works. But if that's true, then maybe the world needs fixing, not by laws, but by how we treat each other in ordinary moments." Maya watched him with tears in her eyes. Lila held her brother's hand under the table, whispering, "That's Daddy's real job, fixing people who don't even know they're broken." Jonathan glanced toward Anderson. "I'm grateful for your integrity, sir, for turning embarrassment into accountability, but I don't want this night remembered because I was insulted. I want it remembered because someone chose to listen." He gestured subtly toward the staff. "These men and women made a mistake. I forgive them, but more than that, I invite them to do better, to lead this place by example." A murmur of emotion swept through the audience. Even the waiters in the back, those who had once laughed, were crying silently. Jonathan's final words came softer but stronger. "If we measure worth by color, money, or name, then we'll never see the miracle right in front of us. Every person you ignore, every stranger you misjudge, they might be the key to your next door. So tonight, if you remember anything, remember this. Respect doesn't start in boardrooms, it starts at the front door." He stepped back, leaving the microphone on the table. For a second, no one moved. Then the entire room rose to its feet. It wasn't applause for a man, it was gratitude for a mirror. And for the first time that night, Everyone saw themselves, clearly. By the time the Coles left Le Parfum that night, the city was already awake. The moment Jonathan placed the microphone down, that quiet, graceful end, someone had recorded it on their phone. Within minutes, it was everywhere. A short clip. Jonathan standing, eyes steady, saying, "Respect doesn't start in boardrooms. It starts at the front door." That single sentence spread faster than any headline could. By sunrise, the video had over 5 million views. Hashtags flooded social media. The door moment. Jonathan Cole, the color of respect. Morning talk shows replayed the footage on loop. Some called him the man who broke racism with calm. Others said the engineer who engineered change. Outside Le Parfum, reporters gathered, microphones in hand, while the restaurant's golden sign gleamed awkwardly under the flash of cameras. Robert and the maitre d' slipped in quietly through the side door, not to defend themselves, but to begin the retraining Anderson had promised. Meanwhile, Jonathan and his family stayed home. He brewed coffee like it was any other morning, while the kids watched the news on TV. "Dad," Ethan said, "they're talking about you again." Jonathan glanced over, half smiling. "Let them. Maybe they'll talk about something that matters next." Lila turned to him. "Are you mad that it's viral?" He shook his head. "Not mad. Just hope people don't turn it into noise. Respect deserves more than a trend." Across the country, people debated what had happened. In diners, barbershops, classrooms, everyone had an opinion. Some said it was a lesson long overdue. Others called it an overreaction, but no one could deny it. Something had shifted. By afternoon, a reporter from CNN stood in front of Le Parfum announcing, "This restaurant, once known for exclusivity, is now at the center of a national conversation about race, class, and dignity." Back in his living room, Jonathan turned off the television. He looked out the window, where the first snowflakes of winter had begun to fall. "Funny," he murmured, "how the world finally listens when you stop shouting." Maya smiled. Maybe that's the only way it really learns. And as the snow thickened outside, Jonathan felt something rare, not vindication but peace, because the truth had done what truth always does. It traveled. By the next week, Le Parfum had become something no one expected, a case study. News anchors called it the dinner that reshaped corporate ethics. Talk shows replayed the footage of Jonathan's speech, while CEOs debated what real inclusion meant on air. But for Anderson, it wasn't just PR. He had seen something shift in himself that night, a recognition that change couldn't be temporary or symbolic. At a press conference outside the company's headquarters, he stood before a sea of cameras and reporters. "After what happened," he said, "we don't just need new policies. We need new people, people who understand that respect is a non-negotiable part of business." He paused, then smiled. "And that's why I've asked Jonathan Cole to lead our new initiative, Project Dignity." Flashbulbs exploded. Reporters shouted questions. "Mr. Cole, will this be a diversity program?" Jonathan shook his head. "It'll be a humanity program. If we teach humanity first, diversity follows." Within weeks, Project Dignity launched across all branches of Anderson's mining and logistics empire. It included leadership seminars, hiring reform, and an annual Respect in Action award, funded personally by Anderson and managed by Jonathan's newly formed foundation. The ripple effect reached beyond business. Universities invited Jonathan to speak about ethical engineering. Government agencies requested his input on training programs for inclusion in public service. And quietly, without fanfare, Le Parfum closed for renovations, not to expand, but to rebuild its heart. Maya watched it all unfold with quiet pride. One night, as Jonathan reviewed new proposals at home, she placed her hand over his. "Do you ever stop to think," she said, "that you changed the world just by refusing to shout back?" He smiled. "I didn't change the world. I reminded it to listen." A week later, when Le Parfum reopened, a small plaque stood by the entrance. It read, "In honor of Jonathan Cole and his family, who reminded us that respect opens more doors than power ever could." The first guests to walk in were a young black couple holding hands. They were greeted with genuine warmth, seated at the best table, and served by the same maitre d' who once turned Jonathan away. He smiled at them and said softly, "Welcome, we've been expecting you." And outside, for the first time, the lights of Le Parfum didn't shine for prestige, they shone for progress. Months later, the winter snow had melted into spring. The city of Boston pulsed with new life. sunlight spilling over the cobblestones, tulips blooming in public squares, and people moving with the ease that comes after change. For Jonathan Cole and his family, life had settled into something gentler. But one evening as they finished dinner at home, Maya placed her hand on his arm and said softly, "Maybe it's time we go back." Jonathan looked up, understanding without needing her to say the place. "Le Parfum?" She nodded. "You closed a door with grace. Maybe it's time to walk through it again, by choice." A week later, they returned. The restaurant looked different, lighter, warmer. Gone was the pretentious gold trim and the heavy silence of superiority. Now soft jazz floated through the air, and the staff greeted guests with genuine smiles. Near the entrance, the plaque with Jonathan's name shone under a soft spotlight. When they entered, the maitre d', the same man who once denied them, stepped forward immediately. "Mr. Cole," he said, voice steady but emotional, "welcome back, it's an honor." Jonathan shook his hand. "It's good to see change feels real." They were seated at the very same table from that night. The kids, now a little older, glanced around curiously. "Feels smaller," Ethan said. Jonathan smiled. "Maybe we just grew." Dinner was simple, filled with laughter and quiet memories. At one point, the maitre d' returned, not to serve, but to say thank you. "I teach new staff every week," he said. "I tell them this place was once famous for what it refused to see. Now it's famous for what it finally learned." Jonathan nodded, moved but humble. That's how redemption works. It doesn't erase the past, it honors it by doing better. As they left, Maya paused by the plaque and whispered, "You didn't just open doors, Jonathan. You changed the light that comes through them." Outside, the evening air was cool and calm. The restaurant's lights reflected across the street, glowing like candles, not of prestige, but of remembrance. Jonathan took his daughter's hand and said quietly, "They tried to humiliate us for our color, but tonight—" He looked back at Le Parfum, smiling softly. "We showed them the color of true character." The city lights of Boston shimmered across the water that night. Jonathan Cole stood with his family, hand in hand, watching their reflection ripple beneath the bridge near Le Parfum. The restaurant's golden glow flickered in the distance, no longer a symbol of arrogance but of awakening. A narrator's voice rose softly over the ambient sounds of the night. There are moments that divide time, before and after. For Jonathan Cole, that moment wasn't about humiliation, it was about revelation. They tried to reduce him to a color, but he became a mirror, showing the world the color of true character. Footage of the family walking down the quiet street fades into aerial shots of the city, people dining, laughing, greeting each other with kindness. In a world where respect has become currency, Jonathan reminded us it's the only thing that costs nothing, yet changes everything. The music swells, emotional but warm. Piano, light strings, the sound of possibility. Cut back to Jonathan's voice in reflection, calm and human. "I didn't fight for revenge, I fought to remind people what decency feels like, because once you remember it, you can't unlearn it." The screen fades to black, and the narrator speaks the closing words. They tried to humiliate him for his color, but he showed them the color of true character. Pause. Soft piano chord. Then, the interactive close appears on screen, in Jonathan's tone. Conversational, personal, warm. "Now I want to know something from you. Where are you watching from? Tell me your city, your country. I'd love to know how far this story travels. And tell me, what did you think of it? From 0 to 10, at how much did this story move you?" The voice grows softer, intimate. If it touched you, subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one, stories that remind us that no matter where we come from, we all deserve to be seen, heard, and respected. The final image. Jonathan's reflection on the water dissolves into the channel logo, Touched Tales, stories that stay with you. The screen fades out completely, leaving one last line in silence. Respect has no color,